Okay, so for this next part, what we're going to do is we're going to take the electrical message that's going through the heart. So remember, you have this internal conduction system of non-contractile cells. They depolarize. When they do that, they create a voltage change, essentially. That voltage change goes through all the heart muscle, the contractile cells, and cause those to also depolarize and essentially contract the heart muscle. So this is really important for how the heart functions, because how do we get blood moving from one direction to another direction if we don't have the contraction of those cardiac muscle cells? We can't. So essentially, this is no different than how we depolarize a neuron and how we depolarize a skeletal muscle cell. There are some slight differences that we're not going to talk about, but one of the things that we can utilize here in terms of like a healthcare setting is that we can actually register the electrical conductivity of the heart on a machine that prints it out in a graphical form, and that graph basically is called an electrocardiogram or an ECG, okay, or EKG. So what you want to do as a healthcare provider is you would hook up your patient to the machine that is going to run for several minutes in order to register what is happening to your patient's heart. Do they have any problems with the not just the electrical patterns in their heart, but with their actual cardiac cycle and how they're moving blood through their heart? And the ECG can actually tell us all those things, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to label this ECG strip. I've kind of cut a smaller strip so that we're just looking at, probably like about a 3-second interval. Usually, I'm sorry, 3-minute interval. You probably do this for at least 6 to 10 minutes or longer to make sure that you have like a nice graphical representation of what's going through your patient's heart. One of the things that you want to know is that each one of these larger squares, that's going to equal 0.2 seconds, okay? So basically, this direction is time, if you don't realize it. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna actually put time at the bottom right here, because I might use some of this upper part when I do my labeling. So each one of these boxes is 0.2 seconds. Okay, each one of these smaller boxes is 0.04 seconds. And that's how we can figure out what's happening over time to the electrical message that's going through the heart. And also we can figure out what's going on in one heartbeat, okay? So one heartbeat is one cardiac cycle where you bring blood in and you push blood out, all within that time period, okay? This direction is millivolts. Kind of the same as when we did this with a neuron, we have millivolts over time, and we can see what's happening internally in our neuron as our neuron goes through the process of depolarizing and creating an action potential, okay? It's kind of very similar. So in this case, what you can do is you can start to register all of these little bumps and valleys as specific time periods of what's going on electrically in the heart, okay? So this very first area, and I think I'm gonna kind of use my highlighter a bit. So this very first area right there is something that we want to label. And then we're gonna have this area here that we're also gonna want to label, that big peak and those couple valleys right there. And then of course, this main large wave right there as well. Okay, so these are the three essential things that at least you should be able to figure out from an ECG strip. Okay, so this first one, sorry, I was looking for my pen. This first one here, this is referred to as the P wave. Okay, the P wave is always a slightly smaller bump before this very large spike here. This very large spike is the R wave. This little kind of depression here is the Q wave, and then this other depression is called the S wave. This whole area from basically the Q to the S is called the QRS complex or the QRS interval, okay? We're just going to label some stuff and then we'll talk about what's happening in terms of our electrical message first in each of these areas. Then after the S, you should have kind of a flattish area, and then you're going to have another much larger bump, and that larger bump is called the T wave. Okay. Then the T wave ends, and you're going to have this flat line area before your next P wave essentially starts again. Okay. From the P wave to the T wave, this is roughly less than 1 second. Okay, so from about here to here. Sorry. I'm going to just make it a little bit higher. So from our beginning of our P wave, actually a little bit before our P wave, but what we're going to see is from the P wave to the end of the T wave, that should not be any more than 0.8 seconds. And we have 2, 4, 6 right there, actually. Okay. So let me just give you the real time. So that's 0.6 seconds. That's one heartbeat, basically. Okay. That's one heartbeat. Or one cardiac cycle. That can be a little bit longer, anywhere from 0.6 to 0.8 seconds in length is usually about one cardiac cycle. Okay. So let's label a couple of other things here. So I do have a diagram up here too, so that you can see that there's other intervals that you can, and segments that you can also label. So I'm just going to use my highlighter and I'm going to label a couple of other places. Okay, so basically going from the P, you can see all the way over to the R. So if we label all this part right about there, that's also called the PR interval. This is our PR interval. And then you do see here, right, you have this short segment where we have our PR segment. The PR segment is a little bit harder to actually label. I'm going to do that with my highlighter over here instead. So like, it's just like this little strip or that little piece right there. So that little piece, this is going to be our P to R segment. What's the difference? It has to do with what you're actually measuring in that time interval or that time period. Okay. And then we'll do a couple more here. So we also are going to see that we have like an ST interval. We have an ST segment. So our ST segment goes from about here. Oh, that was not the color that I wanted. I thought that was purple. There we go. Now that's purple. Okay. Right there is our S to T. So our S to T segment. So the segment is the smaller portion, whereas the longer portion is going to be the interval portion. So here we have like S to T interval, and the S to T interval, you can see it like ends at the end of T, which I actually need to erase this just a little bit right there. And it's like from here to like maybe about right there. So that's our S to T interval instead. Okay. And then we have one last one, our S, so we did S to T interval. We can do a Q to T interval, and the Q to T interval I can make in a highlighter color. Let's see, we'll make that green. So Q to T is basically at the beginning of the Q part all the way over to T. So it includes all that area. That big block area right there. So it's our Q to T interval. Okay. And then you can see from here to here, one R peak to one R peak, This is called our R to R interval. And that basically signals like one heartbeat to the next heartbeat, okay? So again, like the middle of one cardiac cycle to the beginning of the other cardiac cycle. So you have to think about all these waves, intervals, and segments are going to relate back to what's happening in the heart at these specific time periods and what is going on with the internal conduction system, okay? You can write this on here, or you could just maybe write it over here. It's kind of up to you. Like the P wave, it's like I was gonna write it all together, but I'm just on this one, I'm just going to write some very simplistic things. So our P wave is actually when our SA node depolarizes. And we know our SA node is in our atria. So basically this signals atrial contraction. Okay, so you see that's why we have that little bump of electricity. Why is it not bigger? Because the atria are not that big, so you don't need that much depolarization to occur. So our P to R interval is basically telling us what's happening with depolarization of the SA node and how that's traveling all the way down to the AV node and then the AV bundle. That's basically what that's telling us. So our P to R interval is going to be SA node to AV node. And it's atrial contraction to the beginning of ventricular contraction. To the beginning of ventricular contraction, okay? So how can we have this over here, this PR segment? So the PR segment, what you notice is that's a little bit of a flat line and a dip. The PR segment is basically the delay between the AV node, the SA node depolarizing and the AV node like depolarizing. So remember, we have to have that delay in the AV node depolarizing so that we can completely contract the atria, and then we're going to start to contract the ventricles, okay? It's like, hopefully you understand what the QRS complex or interval is going to tell you. That tells us ventricular contraction. So in this case, what we're going to see is our AV node, our AV bundle, and our bundle branches start to contract. Those are all going to depolarize. Of course, in a segment, right? In a sequence, okay? And this is ventricular contraction. Then you have this flat area in this S to T segment. So again, the S to T segment is basically going to be when the Purkinje fibers are still depolarizing. And you're going to have ventricular ejection at this point. I'm going to write that down here. So the bundle branches to the Purkinje fibers really are depolarizing. I know I told some of you guys in office hours that, so I don't want to be inconsistent. And that is going to signal ventricular ejection. Okay. So remember, at this time, this is when atrial relaxation is happening. So here you have ventricular contraction and atrial relaxation. I'm just going to write relax. Again, ventricular ejection is atrial relaxation. Okay. Then we're going to see we have our T wave, and where I'm going to write my T wave is I'm going to write my T wave over here because I didn't really like plan this out. very much. But our T wave has this like bump upwards because this is going to be ventricular relaxation. So in this case, we're going to have repolarization. You don't remember repolarization. Remember, depolarization is when our when our cell actually starts to bring sodium in and it becomes more positively charged, right, internally. In repolarization, we start to push out potassium and our cell is going to start to go back to its normal resting state, okay, in a negative millivolts, essentially. Here you see mostly we're at 0 millivolts at rest, essentially, okay? But our T wave is going to be repolarization starting at the apex. So there's still this bump of electrical message because the apex repolarizes and the Purkinje fibers are still actually depolarizing up towards the superior portions of the ventricles. And that's why you still have that electrical message inside of the heart at that time period. So this is actually technically ventricular relaxation. Okay. Don't think it's atrial contraction. The atria is not contracting yet. The atria has to wait for its contraction. So most of the cardiac cycle, the atria are actually relaxed. They're only contracted during the P wave. That's the only time they're contracted. Okay. The ventricle itself, though, is going to be contracting for most of the cardiac cycle. And then it has to go through that period of relaxation. Ugh. Miss my desk. Okay, so that's our T wave. So what about the ST interval? The ST interval is basically this, this strip right here that's basically telling us ventricular ejection to ventricular relaxation. That's all that's telling us. The Q to T interval is telling us all about what's happening to the ventricles. That's all that's telling us. So you see how, like, if you start to understand what's happening to the electrical messages using the EKG, then you can start to figure out what's happening to the heart in terms of the heart contracting based on which of the contractile cells are depolarizing, meaning the muscles around them are going to be contracting. And that's going to tell you a lot about how blood is flowing through the heart, right, at the time period. So if the ventricles are relaxing, you should kind of understand what valves are open, what valves are closed, where is blood flowing to, right? If we have ventricular ejection, you should know where blood is flowing to at that time period. Now, usually an ECG is going to be evaluated for whether or not it's normal or abnormal. This is a normal ECG because I have one P wave for every QRS complex. My R to R intervals are regular, meaning the amount of space between these R peaks is about the same, okay? Then you want to think about looking at your heart rate. Your heart rate should be anywhere from 60 to 100 beats per minute. And you look at the number of R intervals over a time period in order to help you figure that out. And there are a couple of other things, like the P to R interval has to be a specific amount of time. I know the QRS complex has to be 0.04 to 0.045 seconds. That means ventricular contraction is happening really rapidly. Like the P wave is actually slightly larger than the QRS complex is, okay? If we do this in lab, which the semester I'm making this video, we're not doing this in lab, but maybe if you're in one of my other classes, sometimes we do this in lab and you get to actually evaluate whether or not ECGs or EKGs are normal. And that's where you start to count the squares to help you figure that out, okay? And you can say, oh, atrial contraction is not happening very fast. It's happening too slow. Or a lot of times if you don't have a P wave, that should signal that your SA node's not firing correctly. If your QRS interval is like oddly shaped, that means that you have some sort of problem probably with your AV node triggering depolarization. So you see, this is how healthcare providers are going to use an ECG to determine whether or not the heart is working properly, okay? So the next part is going to be like putting it all together, like looking at the cardiac cycle, putting it on top of the ECG so we understand electrically what's happening, along with how is blood flowing and what's happening to all the different components of the heart as the heart goes through its one cardiac cycle. Okay.